Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. Hey everybody, welcome back to the For Food's Sake podcast. Today we welcome back Carey Gillam on the show. Carey is an investigative journalist, a former senior correspondent for Reuters International News Service, and the current research director for consumer group US Right to Know. Carey's been covering stories focused on agriculture and big food business for over 20 years now, and she's the author of a fantastic award-winning book called Whitewash: The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science. Now, Carey's been on the podcast before. In February this year, we had a really interesting, in-depth conversation on Monsanto, which is, of course, the agrochemical corporation that's most widely known for its herbicide product, which is called Roundup. And it's also the company that was recently acquired by Bayer, the German pharmaceutical giant. And it has now made Bayer the biggest seed and agricultural chemicals maker in the world. So in that episode, we covered Monsanto's history, its rise to prominence, its business model, as well as the politics and the controversies, the cover-ups and the conspiracies that surround Monsanto. So I would highly recommend you check out that episode first to get all the context and the background behind Carey and I's conversation today. In today's episode, we'll be doing a walkthrough of the world's first ever court case against Monsanto Company over claims its Roundup herbicide product causes cancer. Now, this is a fascinating trial that's been very much in the news and that Carey has covered and reported on extensively in great detail. It's also an extraordinary and powerful story of a man, Dwayne Johnson, who's a father of two with terminal cancer, who has brought Monsanto to trial to seek justice and the truth. There's certainly still many twists and turns ahead in this story. This really is history in the making here, and I'm really grateful to be joined by Carey today to talk us through the trial. We have Carey Gillam on the line. Carey, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So lots happened since we last talked, which was around 8 months ago. The Bayer deal finally went through, acquiring Monsanto, and they've officially dumped the Monsanto name. Not that we're going to forget or anything. And then, of course, there's the trial, the Dwayne Johnson versus Monsanto Company trial, which has been all over the media headlines, really, and which you've covered extensively. So what I'd really like to do here is to deep dive into that trial and to do a sort of step-by-step walkthrough of what's happened, and then briefly talk about some of the implications. So let's start with a bit of context. Describe who Dwayne Johnson is and why he's suing Monsanto.
Sure. Lee Johnson, he goes by Lee. His first name is Dwayne, but he goes by Lee. He's a 46-year-old man. He has two little boys and is married and lives in California, Northern California. Worked for the Benicia School District, and basically his job, it was a very good job for him. He was very happy to have it. Paid him about $50,000 a year and helped him take care of his family. And he was an integrated pest manager, which meant he controlled weeds and rodents and just any sort of problem on the high school or the middle school grounds or the softball fields around the elementary school, et cetera. And I was very proud to have the job and loved it. But a big part of it was spraying herbicides like Roundup and Ranger Pro, which is another Monsanto weed killing product. And he, testified that he sprayed that on a regular basis around the grounds from giant, tanks. And he wore a lot of protective gear because he knew how toxic, these chemicals could be. But he had a couple really unusual and large exposures during his work time when a hose broke in one incident and then a backpack sprayer leaked in another one. But got him quite doused in the weed killer, and he developed a very vicious form of terminal cancer that started with lesions on his skin and basically has now invaded, his body and is a terminal type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Okay, and so he decided to sue Monsanto because he thought that they were responsible for gross negligence, or.
Well, so the way he describes it, and I've been fortunate enough to spend quite a bit of time talking to him just one-on-one. The way he describes it is, he didn't have any idea what happened or why. He wasn't that after that first incident. He wasn't that concerned. I mean, he came home and took a shower several hours later, but didn't think that he would develop cancer or anything on his skin. And, he'd been told that he said that this was safe, a very, very safe product, safe enough to drink. He said he was even told. So he wasn't too worried, of course, until he started developing these lesions and started seeing doctor after doctor after doctor, and they got worse and worse. And he finally, was Googling around on the internet, trying to figure out what possibly could have caused this. And started being concerned about the herbicide and started looking things up about it. And that's when he came to find out, that there were concerns about Monsanto and about its herbicides, and that the International Agency for Research on Cancer called it a probable human carcinogen. And that's when he first became aware of it. And then he started Googling for legal advice and came across this law firm that was suing people and signed up with him. And then he became the very first plaintiff to go to trial.
Yeah. And how come he's the very first to go to trial? Is there a specific reason why this one made it through whilst others didn't?
Well, it's not so much that others didn't. I mean, there are, many hundreds, actually thousands that are proceeding. And here in early 2019, we're going to just, it's boggling my mind trying to get them all organized. There's so many that are going to start happening, just one after the other, some of them at the same time. But his lawyer, the Miller firm, asked for an expedited trial because his condition was considered so dire and he was not expected to live very much longer. And so they took his case to trial first. And that was began in June and concluded with the jury verdict on August 10th.
Right. And I mean, as far as trials go, to my understanding, that's a pretty fast trial, right? I mean, how did the trial unfold? Like, what were some of the highlights and key points in the trial?
Well, just the jury selection was a very, sort of tense and time-consuming endeavor. Monsanto expressed to the judge, how concerned they were about getting a fair jury. They said that they didn't think they could, that so many people already thought of them, as an evil company, with a bad reputation, a company that couldn't be trusted. And they reported to the judge that a lot of their employees and lawyers were getting death threats, on their phones or even in like postcards sent to their homes. And so, the jury selection took quite a long time. And actually, I was surprised that they were able to find people who said they'd never heard of Monsanto. They didn't know anything about any of this. So, they came up with a pretty good jury, a lot of some highly educated people. Then they began to lay out the evidence, and they laid out a lot of scientific evidence, of course, different epidemiology and toxicology studies that IARC looked at and that other scientists have said, raise concerns about these chemicals, and not just glyphosate by itself, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, but the actual formulated products like Ranger Pro and Roundup that are used with surfactants like POEA that was banned in Europe because it's found to be so dangerous. So they laid out all the science, and then they laid out all these internal Monsanto documents, that we've talked about in the past that show Monsanto really working hard to suppress the science that showed evidence of harm and working to ghostwrite different pieces in the scientific literature and working to mobilize sort of, this secret army of soldiers that they could send out with marching orders to promote the safety of their herbicides And all these people appear to be independent, and yet they're, working in collaboration with Monsanto. That's part of what we've discovered in all these documents. So they laid all that out for the jury, and, the jury didn't like it and came back with a unanimous verdict of $289 million, and 250 of that was punitive damages, because they said they found that Monsanto acted with malice or oppression. You can see in the jury forms and the jury notes that they sent back, they were mystified as to why Monsanto would not pay more attention to these warning signs. Why, whenever there was a scientific study that showed harm, why they didn't want to follow up on it, why they didn't seem to be alarmed about it and want to, dig in deeper and figure out how to protect people. That's not what you see in the documents. What you see in the documents is they try to figure out how to protect themselves and their product and their profits. And that really didn't go over well with the jurors.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially the kind of, that part of malice, of trying to kind of hide information, must have been pivotal, because the kind of, the debate around whether it's a probable carcinogen seems to be much more scientific and kind of still, for some people, at least in the balance. But I guess the part about the kind of malicious intent or the negligence part must have really played on the jury.
Right. And, what people need to understand is that the jury was not weighing in on the chemical glyphosate and saying, the science shows that this is a definite carcinogen. What they were doing was looking at whether or not this formulated product, Roundup and Ranger Pro, significantly, substantially, either one of those terms you want to use, contributed to his cancer. And they found that, yes, it did. And they found that Monsanto had knowledge about the dangers and failed to warn consumers, failed to warn Mr. Johnson. That's a big part of the trial of the case, of the plaintiff's arguments. There's no argument that says you should ban this. It should not be on the market at all. It should be banned. What the argument is that there's plenty of information out there that Monsanto had that they should have warned consumers about, and they didn't. And again, that resonated with jurors.
Yeah, I had a look at the verdict, and it was kind of divided into three sections: the design defect, the claim of strict liability and a failure to warn, and then the claim of negligence. Just on the implications, so you mentioned, punitive damages, 250 million. The compensatory damages were just under 40 million. I think it was 39 million. I know it's still very much early days, but what are some of the wider implications that this trial might have for Monsanto?
Well, if the verdict stands, obviously it's a problem for Bayer and for Monsanto, because, of course, there are many, many more trials like this that are coming up. So if the verdict stands and the jury award stands, or even if it's just reduced somewhat, you still have then this finding on the record. And the plaintiff's attorneys say that they have many more documents. And in fact, they are asking for more documents even now from Monsanto. Monsanto estimates it's turned over about 15 million pages of documents so far from internal records. They're turning over more now. The attorneys say, that basically you ain't seen nothing yet. They say that there's much more evidence of Monsanto's efforts to manipulate the scientific record,
right,
with respect to this chemical and this product. So, if this snowballs into hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of damages for Bayer and Monsanto, that's a real problem. And investors have already shown that they are very concerned about this.
Right. And this is just for this trial alone, in the sense that if this goes to like an appeal, it could essentially still get a lot worse for Monsanto. It's not necessarily that could the punitive damages increase just with this trial, or would it have to go to other trials?
No, there certainly would not be an increase in punitive damages. The judge could reduce the damages. She could set aside the damages. She could order a new trial altogether. This is what Monsanto's asking for. They filed basically the first round of, what could be considered appeals earlier this week. And they are looking for the judge to either order a new trial or to issue a judgment notwithstanding that basically would overrule the jury and lower the damage award. So the plaintiffs have yet to weigh in on that. So we shall see how that turns out, But then Monsanto, if they don't win at this early round, they have promised to continue to appeal. So, this could go on for at least another year, if not more.
Yeah, and Bayer's argument is, I guess, very much focusing on the scientific argument, right? That it's not a probable carcinogen, that there's nothing dangerous. I mean, that's got to be their push, at least publicly. I've seen, Bayer talk a lot about just the jury having gotten it wrong and that the product is safe.
Right. I mean, they've reiterated basically what they said in court, to the jury, that the science supports their side. The epidemiology is definitive in terms of supporting the safety of it. They continue to throw out a number of 800 studies that show it to be safe, which, no one that I've seen or talked to actually can list those 800 studies. There certainly are not 800 studies that show it's not a carcinogen. So, they throw that out. They say that the counsel for the plaintiff engaged in misconduct and, unfairly got the jury to make a decision based on emotion, not on fact, that kind of thing. So we shall see how that plays out.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like it's almost Monsanto's tobacco moment. Like it's the same kind of debate, maybe the beginning to, of the end of glyphosate's dominance or at least.
Yeah, I mean, again, who knows how it will play out. And the tobacco comparison is a bit ironic, of course, because that was one thing that Monsanto was so adamant about in this trial, that they did not want any comparisons to the tobacco industry. And the facts that have come out about how the tobacco industry, promoted its products, of course, as being so very safe and hid information and manipulated information that showed that they weren't safe, until they just basically couldn't cover it up any longer, which, has only really been in recent years. So they did not want any comparisons to the tobacco industry, even though, ironically, one of the lead lawyers for Monsanto in this trial, his claim to fame is defending the tobacco industry. So, that was kind of interesting. So, there's a lot of stuff here to fight over. I just think it's fascinating to watch it. Lee Johnson, of course, is hoping very much that the award is upheld. He hasn't worked. He's not working now. He's going back through chemotherapy again. His wife is still working about 14-hour days. When I visited with him, he had just gotten back from the oncologist, and he, was essentially alone. His wife is working. His kids are in school. He has to take care of himself, take care of his medication, take care of, cooking his own food, his own meals. And, that's a hard thing when you're going through chemotherapy, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And with all the media buzz, I mean, it's easy to forget that at the end of the day, this is a person's life we're talking about here. It's not just a trial.
Right. Yeah. And it's been very stressful on him, I think, just all the media attention and the spotlight on his life. He's somebody who wasn't used to that by any means, and just lived kind of a quiet life until now.
Yeah. And so what's next for, I guess, not just his trial, but I saw now that the next one coming up is Jeff Hall. And are there any cases outside the U.S.? I see a lot of focus on the U.S., but I imagine there must be some outside of the U.S. as well.
Yeah, I'm getting some information about another case that, and I cannot pull it up in my brain right at the moment. I believe it might be in France, but there are plaintiffs who are looking to file actions in other countries. Of course, there's a different, standard of evidence and of argument in other countries. But in the United States, there are many more. Jeff Hall's case is scheduled for the first week of February. There are 2 at the federal level that will probably also be happening in February. Those are going through the MDL right now, the multi-district litigation in San Francisco, but those are being scheduled for February. There's another case of a married couple who both have non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and are suing Monsanto. And they're trying to get that trial expedited as well because of the age and the health condition of these people. So potentially you could have that, January, February. There's another case in Montana, being expedited. So again, there are, people all around the United States, and 2019 should be a very busy year for plaintiff and defense attorneys fighting over these matters.
Yeah, and a very busy year for you, I'm sure.
Trying to keep track of the documents and get them up on the website to be useful. We maintain a website at US Right to Know where we share the court documents from the different cases that are proceeding. And yeah, it's getting a little tricky to stay on top of them.
Well, it's great what you're doing, and it's fantastic reporting. And I think now more than ever, that's what we need, right? Some good, honest reporting. So, Carey, thank you so much for your time. I know it's in great demand at the moment with everything that's going on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
If you want to keep up to date with everything that's happening with the trial and with Monsanto, I'd highly recommend you go to the US Right to Know website. That's www.usrtk.org. And to follow Carey on Twitter. She's constantly tweeting and keeping everyone updated on what's going on. Her handle there is at Carey Gillam. That's CareyGillam. And of course, do check out Carey's book, Whitewash, as well as the episode that we did together on the For Food's Sake podcast. That's episode 26. We need to talk about Monsanto. I will provide all of those links, of course, in the show notes, as well as a few interesting articles I came across on this topic. That is it for now, guys. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by subscribing via iTunes, by rating and reviewing the show via iTunes. You can find, stream, and listen to the podcast on all of your favorite podcast apps, or you can go directly to our website, that's www.forfoodsake.me, and stream them directly from there. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The social media handle for all those platforms is For Food's Sake Me. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.